that are out their vaccination status?
No, I don't think it's likely. I'll read that for you. Thank you. Okay. What that means is that we think there's a degree of herd immunity amongst these professions. That means if you're not vaccinated and everyone around you is, it means A, you're much less likely to get it, B, you're much less likely to spread it, including the people you're working with, including the people you're interacting with, like your patients, like your students. As a result, we think this wasn't unnecessary. And moreover, it was actually found to be unnecessary by the courts, right? The court looked like it wasn't good enough justification to implement mandates and that sort of place. Okay, why do we think it's also ineffective as well? So why do we think that at least 1% of the profession not vaccinated already were vaccinated? I think it's because of the legitimate feeling of alienation. Firstly, because they just have distrust in the healthcare system a lot of the time. Maybe they had a bad experience at it in the past. Maybe they know people they've had. This is especially likely to be people like Maori, Pacifica, women being discriminated in the past, might be immigrant families who just prefer like Chinese medicine and didn't have this properly explained to them. Secondly, they're just really, really scared. And I know like people like to paint these people as crazy a lot of the time, but I actually think it would just be incredibly frightening to really, really think that you were going to die, or you were going to be hurt, or your kids are going to be worse off. That's just really frightening. Final thing to say is I think often this is because people are wary of the government, right? They're really kind of scared of losing agency over their bodies, especially in light of lockdowns. They lost touch with their social network. Now they're really scared of what the government's doing. Know that none of these reasons that people don't get vaccines are changed by the vaccine mandate, and know that there are really strongly held beliefs that mean people genuinely fear for their life, they're willing to sacrifice their job. As a result of these vaccine mandates, nothing changes, they simply lose their job. At the end of this point, nothing has been changed. These mandates fail to achieve anything, apart from probably just staff shortages. Okay, why does public healthcare it works? Know that what I'm going to talk about is cyclical process that puts people in an informational ecosystem that radicalizes them over time. Who does this affect? Firstly, just all those people who are now losing their jobs right in the profession. But secondly, I think it's way more people than that, right? It's probably a huge amount of proportion of wider society who hear about these mandates and who see that they're getting really hyped up. Why is it hyped up? It's probably just on the news all the time. The political parties have a real incentive to push it. Winston Peters ran like a whole election campaign on it. And also probably goes to court a lot of the time, as we saw it did. And all these people are also just generally scared of slippery slopes, like supermarket workers thinking, oh, maybe it's going to target me next time, maybe they're mad about half their families. I think a lot of people get affected by the hype around vaccine mandates. Why do they feel so alienated? I think it just concerns bodily autonomy at a level that lockdowns, for example, just didn't, where people genuinely fear for their life. You just simply feel just deeply oppressed by tyrannical government that is now essentially forcing you to put something really scary that you know nothing about, that you just don't understand, because you're just a normal person who doesn't understand like science that well, put it into your body. And I think that's really scary. I think it creates sob stories, and you feel really sympathetic for people that you can violence created that kind of thing. I think this results in being put into an informational ecosystem. Know that a lot of these sorts of these communities, you should need to be willing to seek out these communities, right? Because your algorithm isn't going to automatically give things to you that are going to radicalize you, or you're not going to be willing to respond to them unless you're already primed to do so. I think probably that looks like starting to look at you like an anti-mandate meme post, or you just think it's a little bit funny when Jacinda is Photoshop as a Nazi, but then probably you just look at the comments of that post, right? You find people who see the world like you do, who are also really scared on their kids' behalf, and you feel a little bit less alone. I think you then probably join an anti-mandate group, and suddenly you're surrounded by others who believe in this grand conspiracy, and that everybody is in this conspiracy. You hear about profit-motivated vaccine companies who are trying to implement some sort of mind control, or at least just make a lot of money off of people dying. You think that the doctors, every doctor in the healthcare system who's pushing this, is also being paid off, and the politicians are in it as well, also getting checks from these companies. You're primed to believe these increasingly radical stories over time, all because you were initially unhappy with the government, forcing you to put something into your body in a way that was just uniquely really offensive to you. What does that look like? I think it probably looks like you now bringing your friends along with you, if they're also on the margins, having conversations with them, they kind of join that community. I think these groups now become even bigger over time, and also they become much louder and begin to get on the news, further getting more people into these groups. I think the content also just gets more and more radical over time, because you just are more willing to accept it. And I also think these people are just, when you're primed to believe that vaccines are going to really have really bad side effects, that's probably when you genuinely feel like you are feeling really bad side effects. And so the cycle continues. What are the outcomes of this? Why is it so bad for public health? 4 things. Firstly, obviously, just fewer people get the vaccine in a world where we have vaccine mandates. All of these people were who would arguably happy to, all these people just simply wouldn't have been exposed to this vaccine mandates have never happened. Second thing to say is there are more in-person gatherings on their side of the house, right? So if you have these groups wanting to meet in person at someone's house, or literally just have rallies, like the Wellington protest being one of the worst super spreaders ever, I think you'd have a huge amount of people who aren't benefiting from herd immunity, like they are outside their house, who now get incredibly ill and die, which is really sad, because they were just really scared in the first place. Thirdly, you think just like less buy-in to public health, right? You're less likely to want to wear a mask, you're more likely to want to shout at people who do. Fourthly, I think you just trust all vaccines, right? Smallpox and measles and other vaccines, they weren't a problem because they didn't have mandates to this level. Mandates cause people to distrust the entire public health system. It causes people to get COVID. It causes people to die.
Thank you very much for that speech. To open up the case for the negating side, I'd like to welcome up the first speaker.
Says this affirmative team's benefits is more people getting the vaccine. But that entire first affirmative speech explained why they are fine with people not getting the vaccine. That is extremely harmful. This negating team prefers to either force them or do things that are harsh. Counterfactual, and then about why more people get vaccinated. On the counterfactual, because I think we hear a very unnuanced take from this affirmative team. Firstly, obviously they're not allowed to mandate it, but secondly, I think the government still on their side recommends it, which I think pops some of the harms that they were talking about. But thirdly, it's obviously still going to be free, still making people take the vaccine, there's no Moderna, that sort of stuff. A couple of integrated responses then. On the counterfactual, they say the counterfactual is then reaching out to Māori and like minorities more. Why? Obviously structural racism isn't solved by this motion. I doubt you believe that. But the fifth thing, and then the other thing they say is, oh, well, political parties use this as kind of a wedge issue. But obviously politics has thousands of wedge issues. It's unclear why this is a particularly hard one. I think they need to do that substantive analysis at second affirmative in order for them to have a push there. Why would people get vaccinated on our side of the house? The context here, the first thing I would say is obviously more than 90% and around 96% of people got vaccinated, and this is well beyond general herd immunity. But note that many more had medical exemptions. What does the comparative look like there? We think that lots of people who have no political opposition to the vaccine might not get it. Why? Firstly, the media at the time traded it as kind of like the flu. It wasn't really in the limelight at the time. We think that when it was compared to the flu, people think, wow, it's fine, it's like people get the flu all the time. Evidence for this is that this was the age of Omicron, where it was perceived to be less dangerous for the average person, and this is the structural reason why this is true. But note, it was more dangerous for the most vulnerable people, and so the media, catering to the majority who obviously are the average persons, tilted towards this view that it was actually fine, but also they want to tell themselves that this is good and this is a new age. The second thing is people were just scared, the second reason why they don't is that people were just kind of scared of needles, and we think that, and note that you might think this is stupid, but the amount of people who sign up for a blood test and then don't go is actually really high. The third thing we tell you is getting a vaccine takes a lot out of people's day. For example, it's like barriers, a lot of barriers that could be overcome with a mandate, but if it's an option now under their side of the house, potentially missing a day at school or doing things that are massive, doing things that are out of your way, that's a massive cost benefit of people. Things like transport, geography, time at work, little things that might shift the analysis of people in the long term when they're weighing up the speculative harm of getting COVID, just might get tilted under their side of the house. That's extremely bad. When we ask people to get vaccinated though, for example, it's work, $30 of getting, $30 you might get paid in a wage, $20 of a tank for fuel, $10 of a bus ticket. As much as these people are vulnerable, barriers and changes in the risk of calculus, especially for low-income people, people who are living paycheck to paycheck, are easily flippable under their side of the house. Which means that people make on their side the wrong long-term risk calculus for them, because obviously people think in the most of them in the short term in these terms of cost, and most people don't assume that they're going to get COVID, especially at this time. I think the fourth group we're talking about in this debate is the other group of people talking about in this debate kind of lean into conspiratorial thinking. But they care more about their livelihood, their work, their ability to be present in society. And the reason for and the evidence for this is that many reasonable people had concerns about the HPV vaccine that came out, despite overwhelming evidence that it was safe. And obviously those numbers went up over the years. But the difference is we didn't have that time to wait in 2025, 2021, and we don't have that time frame. Don't underestimate the size of all the different kinds of people I just told you about. Because in 2021, lots of people were doing it tough. Lots of people had to make that, trip off work and miss those wages, especially because the inflation was rising and most people were out of work for a long time because of COVID and shutdowns. And also in 2021, lots of people were online, sitting around, more access to things like conspiratorial things that they might necessarily be interested in, might scroll past us on their Facebook feed. Those are the kinds of people that are affected by this motion, and I think a large group of people. Before I move on the massive negative impacts this has in society, I'll take your point.
Can you respond to my analysis on the type of people in these professions that make these mechanisms particularly unlikely to apply?
So your analysis is, wow, educated people are smart. But I think educated people are fallible. There was plenty of stories that I'm sure you've seen on the news of people who might do a wrong risk calculus. People are easily able to think irrationally. And because they were inside for many, many months during COVID, and the fact that COVID was a pandemic that people had never seen before in their lifetimes, I think many of those educational people just did slip. And obviously that's human, and making mistakes is normal, but this has massive implications for that society. The impact for this is, firstly, this individual person is way less likely to receive the severe effects of COVID with the vaccine. Because we know that in 2022, when we opened back up, people will catch COVID with hindsight. Obviously, they feel less shit as a result, and they get the less work. We caught the worst impacts of COVID, like people dying, like people getting really, really ill and having a hard time. But secondly, in regards to herd immunity, some people we know can't get the vaccine. And it's not fair to suffer being completely isolated, being unable to learn a wage, or unable to go to a hospital because you're uncertain about the type of nurse who will treat you, you're uncertain if the doctor is an anti-vaxxer or not, because on their side, they admit that these people don't tell them, and obviously they have a reason not to, because it's private information. Meaning, these people will become isolated, because obviously death is the worst impact in the world for them, so they do that risk calculus. They never enter society, they're stuck in isolation. Think about the effects that does to people's brains. We were all melted during COVID, but these people have worse impacts. Because obviously some of these people have pre-existing conditions, they can't go to the hospital for a checkup, that's literally potentially their life at stake. These are a massive group of people. Even if they are small in your mind, they have massive impacts on their lives. The third thing is the burden on the healthcare system. Because we know that the vaccine led to so many different kinds of COVID and way less hospital isolation. This saved the government millions of dollars, millions of less debt which spent on things like stimulus packages after 21, spent on things like other ways to help people basic day-to-day stuff to get them through life. But more importantly, we had less people taking up ventilators because educated people on their side of the house still obviously can catch COVID, and the types of groups that they were talking about are most likely to catch COVID, we think. They are teachers, they are doctors, they are nurses, they are the people who have to interact with people every single fucking day. Obviously, the most sick people in society are more likely to give you the disease, which means that obviously COVID doesn't stop for cancer, doesn't stop for gestative heart failures, doesn't stop for things like lung diseases. These people who go to the hospital, who interact with these people, deserve as much to have a bed in the hospital available, surgeons who are able to work on them, nurses and ventilators importantly available. Obviously, these people don't consent to other people's choices. We think these people who are educated on their side of us have the additional burden to be fucking smart and take the vaccine, even if they are scared, because I was scared and I still took it. The fourth thing to say here is it made COVID recovery so much better, because when more people, especially high-risk people, have the vaccine, you spread it less, which means that more people feel okay going out, which means they do things like participating in the economy and actually getting business back on track. But the fifth thing to end my speech was people felt safe again, especially going to the hospital. We were often at our most vulnerable. We were trapped in our home. We know that people with pre-existing health conditions felt scared. The dread that they feel should be the dread that you get. The dread that you get, proud to stand in opposition.
affirmative team to continue their case.
Nick wants to talk about safety. Well, I don't think that the 13-year-old school children who were being abused on the street for wearing a mask in Wellington Central felt very safe during the vaccine mandate protests either. I think it's very telling that Negating is unwilling to engage with all of the harms that we give you, absolutely no recognition for all of the stuff about why conspiracy and distrust in medicine and public health gets so much worse on this side. A couple of things to do in my speech. I think firstly I'm going to talk about the reasons why people do or don't get vaccinated on either side, and also very crucially talk about the kind of people that this vaccine mandate actually covers. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why we think this is actually not too bad for people who are worried about infection, and then finally I'm going to talk more about why we think that trust and all of it and stuff about why public health just gets so much worse on their side. Okay, so firstly then, and why we think that people don't get vaccinated. I'm going to start with what Negating tells us. Firstly, that they think that it's only the I think this is so deeply untrue. We could just come out of a year and a half of literal lockdowns and all of this stuff about how it was a global pandemic, millions of people had died. I think this is just a blatant lie. Secondly, they tell us that people are scared of needles, and that's why they did not get the vaccine, and that's why people don't go and get blood tests. Note that their third mechanism rebuts their second mechanism, because they tell you people don't get vaccinated because they have stuff in their day and they can't get time out. That's also the reason people maybe don't get blood tests. But I think also, I think that the government did give people incentives to get vaccinated. Remember when they were handing out free food, and I think that was a really good example of things that we could do more of on our side when there's still political incentives to do education and that kind of thing. But note that all of the reasons that they give you as to why we can help people out, we can also do on our side in terms of increasing vaccination. Okay.
This isn't a debate about different levels of political capital. Obviously, the government has the same incentives to protect people. The only difference is the motion. Can you please respond to that?
Yeah, sure. As I said, there's still the same incentives to protect people. I think when you don't institute vaccine mandates, there's still a really strong pressure, and so you maybe turn to other things. That's just the way that accountability factual works. Okay. So things to do then in terms of why we think people actually on our side don't get vaccinated. Oh, note also that most of the cases was around people who just simply can't get time because they're working all the things. Note that we characterise people who are subject to mandates are police, are health workers, are teachers. These are not people who are just working 80-hour weeks and don't have time, right? And then they weigh these issues with accessibility and education. Also, the employer can probably just give them a bit of time off work to go and get the vaccine if they need. At the end of this point, we're simply hugely mitigate their impacts, because most of the people that they tell you need to get vaccinated more under their side are simply just not impacted by the mandates at all. Whereas uniquely, our stuff is not contingent on, our stuff affects world where if you take like a medical intervention like a vaccine or a pill and you think something is going to go wrong, whenever you experience any kind of bodily harm or side effect, you associate that with the vaccine. Now, if you think the vaccine is bad, they're associating all of these possible different side effects on it. They're posting all of them on the side effect registry that is totally publicly accessible, and there's all this media stuff. Wow, there are thousands and thousands of these crazy side effects. People are logging it in record numbers, and so there's all this fraud just continues and continues and continues, really elevating the problem and making things so much worse. Again, I don't think there's evidence on this side. When you don't breed as much distrust, when you don't force all this stuff to go to the media. Secondly, on the idea of authority forcing you, I just think whenever you feel as if you're being oppressed and your life is at stake because of these bad incentives by the government and big pharma, you never back down, right? This is your life. This is your life that you care about, and you're not about to get pushed around. Then, on the stuff, I think I need to cover about why we think that this becomes a big thing in the media and why parties play on it. Because James says, oh, why is this a particular thing that parties would choose to use? Two responses here. I think, firstly, again, as we have already told you, lots of times, it is a very emotional topic. When you believe that the government is out to get you, when your health and your life is at stake, when you're worried that you're going to get like pericarditis and drop dead when you have this vaccine, it is life or death for you. But secondly, I think it's also really easy political points. And if you are with some Peters and you're like, well shit, I've been out of Parliament for a whole term and I really need something to get me relevant again. Oh, I see vaccine mandates. I'm really going to work for this and get a really guaranteed voter block by being anti-vax. I think that means that it's a really easy target for politicians who want to prey on that. So again, it comes back in the media, people distrust it, all of this stuff. I think I filled in a lot of the gaps that James identifies there. But now I'm going to go over the outcomes again to identify really what the harms are, because I think that these were completely unresponded to. And note again that because they get such a few people increasing in vaccine mandates, we told you that it's only the ones who are lacking in education who are possibly going to uptake on their side. It's the ones who deeply believe that the state is against them, who will never ever get it on either side of the house, and it's instead worse than on their side. I think that means that they actually get very few benefits in terms of herd immunity compared to what we tell you already exists under the status quo without these mandates. But as Abby tells you again, I just think this gets way worse under their world. Fewer people get the vaccine because of this sort of anti-vax material. But as I flagged in my intro, also, when you believe that you're up against a giant conspiracy, you network, you meet together, you have like plans about how you're going to get past this kind of authoritarian government. So that means that you all meet up at Parliament, right? And you have a massive anti-vax protest. And what happens when you get some unvaccinated people together, spreading around the COVID everywhere? Huge super spreader event that caused a huge amount of increase in hospitalizations, all the harms that they wanted to talk about on their side. Okay, I also think there's just less buy-in in public health in general, and I cannot emphasize enough the harms of this. When people are no longer getting measles vaccines, there are now huge, big outbreaks overseas, and they're starting to do just a case in Hamilton the other day. Okay, that never happened 20 years in the past. There's also distrust in masks. So people now will abuse people who are wearing masks in public, all this kind of thing. I think you just basically destroy a lot of the trust in medicine that we've worked so hard to build over the last 15 years or so, and it just means that so many people get worse off on their side for very, very, very little benefits. So to understand.
Thank you very much for that speech. To continue the case for the negating team, I'd like to welcome up the second speaker.
Few questions to go through. The first thing I want to do is I'm going to talk about would people still get vaccinated without this mandate, then about conspiracy theories, but before that I want to explain why there are alternative policies that they think will supposedly happen on their side to get things like increased Māori health rollout is not what this debate is about. I just think that the idea that there is political capital that has to be reallocated is just so obviously incorrect given the context that we're talking about. The government is maxed out on political capital to do things to respond to the pandemic on either side of the house. We are talking about a time where we are ending lockdown, so people, so obviously it means that this is a time when people think that they want to vaccine rollout. Obviously, we explained that this is a uniquely good policy that must happen, but even to the extent we think there are other good policies that they could happen, those are obviously also going to be implemented, because the government doesn't want to fuck over the COVID response after they just spent 2 years literally only campaigning on that. That means that they have every incentive to do things like go into extra debt, do things like cause inflation, to just max out literally every single possible thing that they could do. I think any Ministry of Health staffer that comes into actually working here in office with an idea, he's just like, yep, let's do it, yep, let's do it. The limited thing is not political capital, it is just simply the ideas and the number of policies that could actually be put out. Let's now talk about will people get it without the mandate. The first thing I want to note is that obviously this is a really critical thing in this debate, because James gives you so many impacts about why, if they cannot reach herd immunity, that does literally mean that immunocompromised people who can't get the vaccine die. That is principally abhorrent. It also means that just more people die overall. It means that people are far more scared to go into places like the hospital, because they have no way of knowing if their nurse is actually vaccinated. And that means that grandma is not going to go for a cancer checkup, because she is scared of COVID and she does not want to have to risk the chance of that. That is abhorrent. Why are people not going to get it without the mandate? The first thing I want to do is point out the lie that is the centre of this team's case. They say that this is only about the police and teachers. This is not. This is about anybody who was a front-facing worker. This was every single supermarket worker. This was every single hospitality and retail worker. We live in New Zealand. Our second largest industry is hospitality. This means we are talking about hundreds of thousands, millions of workers, and so this is a massive group of people. What this also does is it means that their case is so unresponsive to our mechanisms, because all they say is their only response to things like people not being able to afford time off work, people not being able to get to pay for transport and things like that is, oh, they're like well educated, so they don't buy into conspiracy theories and they're wealthy. Obviously, people who work in a supermarket are not wealthy. These people do have the barriers that James tells you about in terms of not being able to afford that time off work, in terms of not having a boss who is like kind enough to just be like, oh, I'm going to give you time off work. They do not care about these poor minimum wage workers. That means that they do not respond, that means their only response to all of those things James tells you about falls flat. But no, they don't even attempt to respond to all of James's mechanisms. James gives you extra things to explain. He gives you the obvious comparison of the flu vaccine, which is to say that this is something that is not mandated, and less than 30% of people have had it, compared it to COVID was mandated 96%. That's quite a big difference in numbers, and obviously the reason for that is the fact that at the point in time when this debate takes place is the end of 2021. This is when Omicron is going into the media, and so this means that people are being told that COVID is actually less deadly. That is false. It was only less deadly for people like you and I. It was not less deadly for Grandma. She was still just as susceptible, and actually more susceptible. So, but what that means is that most people just didn't actually think that they needed this vaccine, because they were being told that, oh, this new Omicron thing, it's not that bad. It's not even as bad as the flu. If you're not getting the flu vaccine when it's not mandated, why are you getting the COVID vaccine when the media is telling you that it is not even as bad as that? Clearly then, there was a massive group of people who are not getting the vaccine under this side of the house. Before I move on, yes.
Can we deal with the fact that over 90% of the population had the vaccine before the mandate was implemented?
That's just actually not true. Let's talk about how it impacts. Let's talk about conspiracy theories. Okay, two groups of people. The first group of people I want to talk about are people who have been oppressed by the state, so these Indigenous people, immigrants, and women. Two things to know. The first thing I would say is that obviously the cost-benefit analysis and all of those previous mechanisms that we give you still applies. Obviously, and obviously these people also have financial oppression by the state, which means that these are the people who are more likely to be working at low-wage jobs, and these are the people who are more likely to have those difficulties that they would overcome when they would lose their job if they don't get this, but where it wouldn't be worth it if they could keep going to their job, and if they could just not have to pay for that transport, not have to pay for the time off well. The second thing I would note is that obviously, as both teams identify, things like Māori health providers were funded by the government to do so, because obviously actually Bloomfield was aware of the fact that Māori do not trust the state because of the abuses of the past. There is a clear political incentive to do this so that the rollout is successful, which means that you do not have to get your mandated vaccine from the state. You can get it from a Māori health provider that responds to all of their claims there. But obviously, and this response also deals with the conspiracy theory idea. I just think that this is quite a asymmetric argument at the point where on both sides of the house, the government is still paying for it. So if you are scared of government influence in your health, that's pretty symmetric. The government is still advertising it, that's still pretty symmetric, and it means that there isn't going to be this large increase in conspiracies. This draws me on quite nicely to the second group of people who are conspiratorial and might not get the vaccine if there was a mandate. Obviously, as I just explained, the only extra thing that the government does that would cause a difference in the number of people who fall into a conspiracy theory and who wouldn't get this vaccine is the fact that the government is actually mandating it. That means that people who are scared of pericarditis or people who are scared of big pharma, they are impacted. That is an entirely symmetric thing because on both sides the vaccine exists. Under our side, sure, the government is mandating it, but the only people who wouldn't get it because of this extra idea of the government mandating it are people who are already incredibly conspiratorial. It is a massive conspiracy theory to believe that the government is mandating it for evil reasons. That is not just a small leap that you can just see one Facebook comment and now suddenly you're radicalized. Obviously, these are people who are already deeply conspiratorial, already hate the fact that the government is providing it, already think that Pfizer are demons, already are going to do things like go to this anti-vax protest that was a super spreader event. So obviously that happens on either side of the house. Right, the final thing that I want to note though is we're able to flip this idea of conspiracy theories because for their mix of things like side effects being really bad and making people not want to get the future vaccine. Obviously that relies on there actually being lots of side effects, which is just anti-vaxxer lies. There are not lots of side effects. So when most people get the vaccine and it goes well, they're actually more likely to think vaccines are good, they're more likely to think big pharma is good. So we flip their claims of measles vaccine. People are more likely to get the vaccine once they've been mandated at this first time. For all those reasons, negate.
Thank you very much for that speech. To close the substantive portion of the affirmative team's case, I'd like to welcome up the third speaker.
asserted a lot of things being empirically true, which makes the debate very messy. So to clarify this, I will promise not to use the phrase empirically true in the speech. If I use this phrase, you're free to dock 1 speaker point for every time I use it. So three things in the speech. Firstly, on framing on why people don't get vaccines. Secondly, on how we engage with those people with provisions covered by the mandate. And lastly, on how we get broader buyout of public health and how that's extremely catastrophic. But firstly, the user. Note the difference in the scope of the impact when they talk about vaccine coverage. At best, they can, if you buy all of the analysis, they enforce mandates on a very narrow set of people. I'll structurally explain then why this is structurally such a narrow group. But our outcomes affect everyone. Everyone who feels slightly alienated, who is slightly afraid of government, or who is slightly afraid of the loss of their agency, is at the brink of being radicalized. And I guess maybe there is a benefit here that Auckland can give you about, people going into these communities and making new friends. They can go on this fun mate trip to Wellington and go down the Farming playground or something. But I think what really matters is that we uniquely break these cycles, and I think it's the most important thing in this debate. So firstly, on framing, why do people choose not to take vaccines? So why is it a very small number of industries that are covered by vaccine mandates? Notably, we tell you that this is about nurses, teachers, and police officers. Notably, these are all public sector areas, and why is this really important? A, because there is much more backlash in the private sector because businesses don't like it when they have to impose a lot more costs on their workers, and they have to pay their workers in a time of such shortages. That means you get a lot of pushback, which makes it more difficult. You don't have to do this in the public sector because the government is the boss. Two, political capital is just highly contentious. We think it's creates a lot of backlash for reasons that both sides agree to. But I think the more broad you apply this mandate, the higher the political cost gets, and it goes already very high. Thirdly, it's just difficult to enforce on a large scale. I used to work in a hospital where I was serving drugs when I was 15 years old. That's clearly illegal, but it's very difficult to enforce a lot of rules on private sector organisations, uniquely when it comes to things like policing and nursing and education. So there's already very high input levels of accountability, things which don't exist for supermarkets, for example. So it's like structurally it's unlikely that all of these supermarket and retail workers are covered by the mandate. We don't think it's true, but I gave you structural reasons for why that is likely to be the case. So why then do people not sure?
Yeah, so ignoring the fact that the average reasonable voter has a memory and knows that you're lying, isn't the for the political incentives material that we give you, isn't the structural reasons why you go to all people because they want the rollout to be as successful as possible?
But I don't think that engages with what we tell you, which is that the costs are exponentially high for the private sector. So even if the cost-benefit political analysis works out for the public sector where there are much lower barriers you have to overcome from the government's perspective, that just is really unresponsive to everything that I tell you. So why else do we think that people still get the vaccine on our side? And I think the key intuition up here is that there's a very big difference between the flu and COVID because flu didn't cause mass grave speed done in New York. So let's be more specific here. What did we tell you for reasons? What reasons to tell you why people still get the vaccine? A, because people just don't want to be sick, noting how many people do get sick at some point, but also noting really how wide scale it is. Secondly, when a particular family, and thirdly, because the barriers are low and the cost is low. The responses they give you here are that the media portrays it as like the flu. I don't think this is true for three reasons. Firstly, because the media often consults with experts because they like to be seen as being having factual reporting and not consulting with experts or getting experts like blasting TVNZ or One News does look bad for the majority of audiences and it makes them buy up. But secondly, the government controlled public health positions to a very high degree, so we don't think that it's structurally true. The media did compare, like if we're going to get analysis of why this is true. But even if this is for whatever reason true in New Zealand, look at the very different international context in which overseas there was a much higher level of deaths and hospitalization, means that you still got footage from overseas seeing the scale of mass deaths, the scale of people in hospitals, and I think that means that counteracts the narrative that things is as simple as the flu. Also, they tell you that's an inconvenience. We tell you why that the really strong incentives are probably overcome, but additionally, we also tell you that there are a lot of measures governments took, both in our world and in the comparative world, where the incentives are even strong for why they make access to vaccines more accessible. Then they tell you that people just they're not too conservative thinking why people opt out of this. I think this is exclusive to our side in contention to what James tells you, because notably, even when the government tells you that vaccines are good, they aren't making you take one, right? The difference is the loss in agency, because you still maintain the view that even if you disagree with it, even if you don't think that the government is right, you still doesn't impinge on your life, because you don't feel that loss of agency like you do on the other side of the house. You know, especially the material that we told you about the slippery slope. Even if people aren't in professions to cover, they're constantly worried that their profession will be next rationally or irrationally. And so why do we tell you about why radicalization happens? We tell you very little response about why you need a cue, right? We feel like a TikTok about Avatar, and the next one the algorithm feeds you this one about how Jacinda Ardern is a lizard. You have to enter it in like a step-by-step scale. That's what we tell you to no response. It starts with liking an anti-vax meme. You get recommended an anti-mandate group. You get put into this is just a cycle of escalation which puts you into an ecosystem which undermines your faith on institutions and undermines your grip on reality. So then how does this speak on your COVID exposure in these professions? Now we tell you that within these professions, you've already probably herd immunity. So not the general rate of vaccination very high for the reasons we tell you, but specifically within these professions, those which are people who are highly educated and are likely to have engaged with scientific literature or engaged with institutions of power, who work for the government, or are less likely to be afraid of the government because they see it as the group that gives them the paycheck. I think that they're just very likely to have that vaccine already, but importantly, the only response here is that James says, oh, we're educated people who can still make mistakes. Sure, we don't have to prove that literally every teacher got the vaccine, but we tell you that it's a structurally very low level for the incentive analysis that we give you to very little response. That means that it's likely herd immunity is already achieved, even one nurse in a hospital isn't vaccinated. So I think that this is upstream of everything I tell you about people right now, but specifically in the analysis about people who are specifically vulnerable. A, importantly, you don't have, and under our side, you don't need to explicitly, you're forced to tell your employer that you're unvaccinated, but you can positively affirm that you are vaccinated. Intuitively, this is how the vaccine pass system was okay. You didn't have to tell everyone that you were vaccinated, but you could choose to tell them that you were vaccinated. It doesn't violate any liberties because you opt into that disclosure of information. We think that most people are likely to disclose this information if they're vaccinated because there's no reason not to. So that crucially means that employees can still make reasonable choices. Reasonably, if a nurse isn't vaccinated, they're not going to be put with the immunocompromised 130-year-old, right? Professions are still rational and reasonable. And importantly, if someone requests to see a nurse that is vaccinated, given that the vast majority of nurses are going to be vaccinated, now likely to disclose that they are vaccinated to their employer, it's unclear why that doesn't just immediately uncover all of the material about you entirely buying out. Lastly, on public health, there was extremely little response here. I think we already made out why the conspiracy theory mechanisms specifically harmful adage and very little response relies on cues that put you on self-fulfilling cycles and feedback loops and how that broadly feeds into your social circle. And you talk to your friends, you talk to your communities, and you spread these views and they disseminate to a very large scale, uniquely on our side. What does that look like? One, it means the COVID response weakens because you get these mass gathering events like on a low level anti-vaxxers meet at someone's house to complain about the government and all of them are unvaccinated, so you bypass herd immunity. B, it looks like mass protests. That's very harmful because they cause massive super spreads. Know how frequent and constant they were in every part of the country. That is much more dangerous than one nurse in a hospital with herd immunity being unvaccinated. But importantly, it also means it triples our response to future public health crises. If they buy into an ecosystem which undermines their faith in public health and undermines their faith in institutions, they're less likely to also get a measles vaccine when there's an outbreak. They're less likely to listen to the government the next time there's a public health crisis. Even at their best, they only get benefits in the now. We get benefits for every future public health crisis our country faces. That is so important in this debate. I don't see how they have any more to win. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. And to close the substantive portion of the debate, I'd like to welcome up the third speaker from the Negating team.
When I was about 14, the Upper North Island had one of the worst measles outbreaks that New Zealand has seen in the last 50 years. And when they went and said, we're so surprised why this measles outbreak has happened. We offer this vaccine for free. We vaccinate people at a young age. We ask, people to come in at 5. We offer boosters, all of these different things for free. Why is it that this, pandemic of measles has spread through the Upper North Island as it has done so? And the reason was that despite it being offered for free, despite it, despite people having reasonable access to all of these vaccines, that people did not get vaccinated because there were other barriers. When they went into South Auckland and said, why are the vaccination rates in schools lower than 30% here when it is free? They said, oh, well, it would have taken me a few hours to take time off of work to take my child in, and I couldn't sacrifice that $50 of pay. They said because the bus ticket was $20. They said because I couldn't have put any, I couldn't afford the gas that was in the tank in my car. And all of those reasons are very real reasons that people do not get vaccinated. And just because they say, but COVID was in the news, people knew about it, it was important to them. But for the average person, we knew that our risk of a severe adverse event from COVID was less than 1%. For the average individual that just was out there, the average individual in South Auckland who faced all of those economic barriers, we knew that the risk of us having an actual adverse effect was extremely low. So when I make that personal weigh up, when a South Auckland person makes that individual weigh up, they know that actually the $20 that I need to spend on groceries this week probably matters more than this extremely small risk of something bad happening to me. And that is why people wouldn't get vaccinated. And that is the material we brought you right back at James that never actually got acknowledged by this affirmative team. The first thing I'm going to do in this debate is, for a moment, I'm going to concede everything that...
Okay, so we told you we can do measures like vaccines were happening at churches, community centres in the city on the weekend after hours.
Yeah.
Measles. Can you respond to our measures?
Yeah, so we also did that on our side of the house. The thing that I'm saying is that these South Auckland mothers are working, 2 jobs. They have children at home they have to look after that they can't find childcare for. It is still a distance to drive if you're rural. That doesn't solve anything. For a moment, I'm going to concede everything that this affirmative team has said. I'm going to concede that less people get vaccinated on our side because of their conspiracy theories. Obviously, that's not true. But I'm going to do that and explain why we still win this debate. Firstly, the major difference between these two sides, if you believe that people, less people get vaccinated on our side or whatever, is where these unvaccinated people actually are. Because on our side, they're stuck at home, not allowed to be in the school. On their side, they are in the school, facing children who are immunocompromised. They are in the hospitals, facing people who are suffering from interstitial lung disease. And that's the major difference between these two sides, even if you believe that people aren't actually getting vaccinated on our side, even if you believe people aren't getting vaccinated on their side. The numbers don't matter. What matters is where these unvaccinated people are in society, who they are facing. Whether that is teachers, whether that's healthcare assistants, like they say, or whether that's actually just everyone like shop-facing workers and all the people who are realistically included in this. It doesn't matter what you believe, because the reality is those unvaccinated people are there and are people-facing. What is the impact of this? Because it's the same impact we told you all the way back at James. 1, immunocompromised people get sick. They claim herd immunity will happen on either side, but it doesn't work that way for them, because an unvaccinated rest home worker can catch COVID from anywhere. And we know that non-vaccinated people work in families, right? Whole families are unvaccinated. They could catch it from any one of their other family members and then go to work, because COVID symptoms do not show up for everyone. And when they go to work and they, change the diaper of an old person or offer them food or do whatever they do, they infect those old people. Those old people whose risk of COVID is far higher than the 1% of that actual work. Notably, and that's how it spreads, and that's why they don't get herd immunity in the way we say. The majority of these elderly immunocompromised people living in close quarters on their side of the house die or have extremely adverse medical events. The second impact is that the burden of healthcare is higher on their side of the house, because front-facing workers are likely to infect others in high-touch industries like nursing, like supermarket shopping, like handling of apples in supermarkets or things like that. And because those are high-touch industries, that increases the number of people who actually get sick. Less money had to be spent on healthcare on our side of the house because people weren't being infected in those sorts of ways, which meant less debt. We had to take on less debt because healthcare was cheaper compared to their side of the house where more people get sick and require healthcare. We had more money for welfare, which means even if you care about those conspiracy theorists that lost their job, we have better welfare on our side of the house to fund their dole. They still get a good quality of life, but the people who die don't have any quality of life, right? The second thing under the burden of healthcare is that there are more ventilators on our side of the house when less people are sick. There are more surgeons to operate when less people need desperate operations. There are more healthcare beds. Because remember, COVID didn't stop people from getting cancer. It didn't stop people from getting interstitial lung disease. It didn't stop people from getting congestive heart failure. All of those people still need the resources that these COVID patients would be taking up on their side of the house. And again, it doesn't matter how many people you think are getting vaccinated, because on their side there is more direct touch facing, there is more face-to-face contact, and that is why they get more spread regardless of how many people get affected. And finally, we already told you that people feel safe to go out again, that stimulates economic activity, etc., etc. Now let's look at why, that's why we win, even if you believe their whole case. Now let's look at why their case is untrue and why we dismargin. The first thing that they say are vaccine mandates only for the public sector, because there would be private sector backlash. I think there might also be private sector backlash when we raise the minimum wage, but we do it because the government is allowed to, and the government has the ability to do that. But secondly, Rob's POI highlights that government decision making does not care about the private sector cost, because they are far more worried about the actual cost to their pocket and their taxpayer money, when they have to pay for high healthcare costs and they have to pay for everything else. Which fights Tony's structural reasons, but also just the empirical thing that Tony would want to talk about. The next question to ask is, do more people actually become conspiracy theorists? They say that people are going to fear for their life because the agency gets taken away when it gets mandated. But ask yourself who actually gets scared when the government tells you to do something, when the government says this is a new law that they're implementing, when the government tells you to do all of these sorts of things. Probably only people who are already sceptical of the government, who already have a predisposition to this skepticism, which is an extremely low amount of people. Even if you believe that and the second group that they talk about are people who might might not understand. For example, people who like Chinese medicine, who might not have a super good grasp on English or things like that. But obviously the outreach that they talked about on their side of the house could also be possible on our side of the house. We know that Asian and Mila people had some of the highest rates of vaccination because we just sent people who spoke their language out there to do it. Even if you believe that some more people could become conspiracy theorists, still a high burden on their side of the house because you have to compare the amount of people that become conspiracy theorists versus the amount of people that weren't getting the vaccine because of those barriers I talked about right at the start of my speech. Obviously, there is a far larger number of people living in poorer areas who face all of those barriers than there are people who are already predisposed to be conspiratorial of the government. There's a small number of people who might already distrust. There's a huge number of people who are working paycheck to paycheck. Huge number of people who live rurally and have to drive a long way to get to vaccine centres. Huge number of people who, know that the risk of an adverse effect for them is extremely low, and know that the risk of not working today is extremely likely to mean they can't pay rent. And that is the trade-off that you have to make in terms of numbers if what you care about in this today is the number of people who get vaccinated. I already told you why we went independent of that, but we went on that flash too. It's a clear need.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd now like to welcome up the reply speaker for the negative team.
I'm going to start this reply with what the fuck is their benefit? Because they try and narrow the debate so much. They talk about conspiracy theories. They talk about right-wingers like Winston Peters. They talk about crazies who protest about Parliament. They talk about people who are alienated by government and professionals telling them that they should get vaccinated, by their business telling them they should get vaccinated, by their friends telling them they're an awful person if they don't get vaccinated. Those things are obviously still true on their side. Tony also says that, well, it's a high cost to mandate for the private sector, despite government power being an all-time high in this debate, especially this is post-lockdown, and also as Harper says, the government just can do this. The third group they talk about is like, people who are scared and maybe might protest. Why has this no impact in debate? Firstly, if you're not an anti-vax person and you're on TikTok, that if you don't click on an anti-government mandate TikTok, you just will click on another one, which is, your friends are shaming you for getting the vaccine. Or these other various reasons, like conspiratorial reasons, they never prove that this is the tipping point for people, or this is such a significant tipping point that it creates a harm that you should actually feel in the debate. Secondly, I would say that this mass protest happens anyway, because you have a memory, this was post-lockdown. People like Brian Carnegie just did protest for other reasons, like the fact that the government was telling them what to do. If there's no protest, then I just think super spreaders had happened anyway, especially because you remember in Auckland 2021, there were other lockdowns, and I just don't think this is a massive tipping point. I think the analysis is really marginal. But even if, why is this not important? The first thing I would say is obviously these people, it doesn't matter if they're scared, they themselves are choosing not to get the vaccine, and by their own analysis they're educated. So, right now the person who told you, you should feel no reason for feeling sorry for these people. That's extremely important. I think they get no benefit in this debate, but if they do, it's extremely marginal. Let's weigh against our case. Why do we get the benefit of more people getting vaccinated? Their comparative is people not getting vaccinated, which just seems to be their entire speeches down the line. The reason, but also it's for the reasons we explained. The fact that they don't do short-term, long-term thinking, and people are irrational, no response. The fact that people are thinking of the cost, and especially by their own analysis, are often marginalised people who've been treated badly by the government. They just don't get vaccinated, especially if this is the tipping point for them. But also, the potential fear of needles, which Julia just brushes away, I think we believe it. One, and also people who have some fair degree of skepticism. One, why is this harmful? Firstly, to individuals, the increased likelihood of spreading sickness and death, especially in areas where you are a doctor, you are a teacher, you are infecting children and patients who might not have a choice to go to a hospital because they broke their fucking leg. I think it's extremely bad. These people can't consent to that. But also, if you're a doctor, you're treating multiple patients, which means that I think that harm is multiplied far more than they get with their psychopaths. But the harm to herd immunity. They said, well, these people are educated. And I just think this is a weird assertion, the fact that people can be irrational and educated at the same time. You obviously know this. But I but also, the fact that people don't know the facts that they're educated and they make rational decisions means that people just won't go to the hospital and that sort of stuff. It's there, and it is a burden to make people, and then they say, oh, well, it's actually not a matter of herd immunity because there's other doctors who can treat you. Even if that's true in Auckland Hospital, it's a burden for rural areas who have a shortage of nurses. It's a burden for places without many teachers because there's a teacher shortage. If that one teacher, you require teachers in your school, that is the difference between many kids getting taught. I think it has a massive implication for down their line. But also, they go and affect people at work because they think it's fine, because of the reason that they explain. I think people are able to rationalise that to themselves. Why is this debate winning? Because one, people can't consent. Two, COVID fucks people's lives up. They either die or they get extremely sick and they pass that on to other people. This is Omicron, which spread really, really fast and found people. This is why we had deaths in the wake of lockdowns being lifted. They make this so much worse. Proud to stand in opposition.
Thank you very much for that speech. And to close the grand finals of Joynt School, I'd like to welcome up the leader of the affirmative team.
Two questions in my speech. Firstly, do more people in the relevant professions get vaccinated because of the mandate? And then secondly, on the impact on public health. On the first question, I think you have to take into account that there is a huge amount of incentive for people to get vaccinated without the mandate, right? I think it's just true that the government did a really good job at learning from 50 years ago where they failed in the past. I think all of you remember the vaccination pushes that came to the churches near you, that came to the community services. You remember hearing about how the government worked with local iwi. You remember how they set up opportunities for people to get vaccinated and after hours so that they didn't have to miss work. But note that even if all the problems that Tama talked about did exist during COVID, I think it exists to a lesser extent on our side of the house because the government has to respond to the pressure to fight COVID in another way. I think we know how a rest of it works. I think it's been on our side of the house. But note that even if these people, even if it's true that they have all of these structural reasons for not getting vaccines, note these people are actually particularly likely to be really offended by having the economy stripped away from them. Because the people that Harper was talking about is the people who have been let down by the government time and time again, the people who are particularly poor, who are struggling. I think these people are incredibly likely to be really, really scared when the government suddenly demands that they put something in their bodies and in the bodies of their children. I think these are the people who are really, really hurt and suddenly entirely switch off. And now, what's worse is that they also bring with them all the people around them. They add fuel to the fire of the anti-vax movement. They hurt everyone else. Maybe these people who can't be vaccinated wouldn't be vaccinated inside of the house. I'm really sorry. That is really, really sad. I think it gets worse on their side of the house. Okay. But finally, even if it's true that people in relevant professions on the next side of the house do get vaccinated more, why do we think this is quite low wage? Firstly, she's telling me it's probably quite a limited number of professions. I don't know, let's not get into that, but just know that most of social professions, right? There's always going to be a limited number of society, whereas on our side of the house, we are talking about everybody who might possibly see this on the news, who's affected. But secondly, regarding the stuff about people being scared of going to nurses, to the doctors, I think we can just be reasonable. I think if you're really scared about this, and this is going to stop you from going and treat for cancer, you are simply going to be able to ask to see a nurse who has confirmed, and know it is easy to positively confirm, that they have had vaccines. But moreover, I think radicalised now. This is a lot bigger if you do buy into the net material that there were mandates placed on supermarket workers and people in hospitality, right? So that just doesn't particularly help them. I think we see an enormous amount of people who are now incredibly offended by the breach of their bodily autonomy, and so I think that's quite problematic for their case. Why do we weigh public health so much? 3 things. Firstly, it just affects a huge amount of people, right? Everyone who sees the news, everyone who hears about it being talked about in the street, everyone who just listens to any election coverage, because it's literally that this is how St. Peter's won got power in the election. So you can say it affects workers in relevant professions too, right? So we're able to co-op with all of their benefits because we are talking about nurses and we are talking about teachers who are also less likely to get vaccinated on their side of the house because of the mandate. And finally, note that honestly, COVID, because of the lockdown, Omicron didn't end up being enormously harmful. So even if we cause a few harms to COVID on our side of the house, we'd much rather protect all these other public harms, these other risks that might come out into the future that could be enormously harmful. We protect people from that. We protect people from COVID and all this debate.
Thank you very much for that speech and for a very high-quality finals debate. I'd like to invite both teams across the floor, shake hands, and the judges will retire now.